Scambodia. Recently, I came across that term on social media, and the more I saw it, the more I started wondering. Are people talking about the same Cambodia I've been visiting for years? Because if you read the comments, you'd think Phnom Penh is full of scams, crime, and dangerous streets. The problem is that many of the people saying those things have never actually been here. So as someone who spent years coming back to Cambodia, I decided to check for myself. What's changed? What's still true? And how safe does Phnom Penh nightlife actually feel now? Let's find out. Mention Cambodia online and you'll see the same comments every time. Scam compounds, cybercrime, criminal networks. And let's be honest, these stories didn't come out of nowhere. Cambodia has been making headlines for years because of exactly these issues. The problem is that many people read those headlines and assume the entire country is unsafe. After spending years in Cambodia, I can tell you that's not how most visitors experience the country. Most tourists aren't visiting scam compounds. They're visiting temples, markets, restaurants, bars, coffee shops, and nightlife districts. That's why it's important to separate two very different things: Cambodia as a country and Phnom Penh nightlife as an experience. Because if you're planning to come here, walk around after dark, grab some food, have a few drinks, and enjoy the city, the real question isn't whether criminal networks exist somewhere in Cambodia. The real question is simple. How safe does Phnom Penh actually feel for an average visitor now? And before we answer that, there's something many people don't realize. Cambodia today is very different from the Cambodia that was making headlines just a few years ago. When you hear Cambodia, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Let me know in the comments. Now here's the part many people miss. Most of those headlines about scam compounds and cybercrime operations were real. But what often gets lost is that this was never purely a Cambodia problem. Similar operations have been uncovered across Southeast Asia, from Myanmar and Laos to Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. These networks don't really care about borders. Yet if you read comments online, you'd think this was only happening in Cambodia. At the same time, authorities across the region started increasing pressure on these operations. More raids, more arrests, more cooperation between countries. Whether they've done enough is a different discussion. But one thing is clear. Cambodia today feels very different from the Cambodia people were talking about a few years ago. And there's another important detail people often overlook. These operations were never really part of Phnom Penh nightlife in the first place. They weren't targeting tourists walking around Riverside. They weren't places travelers were visiting for a night out. In fact, the people behind them wanted as little public attention as possible. If you came to Phnom Penh for a weekend, there's a good chance you wouldn't even know these operations existed. They were largely separate from the bars, restaurants, nightlife districts, and everyday places most visitors actually spend their time. I've been coming to Phnom Penh for years, and one thing I've noticed is that many people still talk about Cambodia using information that's years out of date. So when people hear stories about scam compounds and immediately assume Phnom Penh nightlife must be dangerous, they're often mixing together two completely different things. Because if we're talking about whether Phnom Penh feels safe after dark, we need to look at what's actually happening on the streets, in the bars, restaurants, and nightlife districts today. And that's where things get interesting. If you followed social media during the police operations, you'd probably think Phnom Penh nightlife was being shut down. That's certainly what some people were saying. So naturally, I went to check myself. Over the following days, I spent my evenings doing what I normally do in Phnom Penh, walking the streets, talking to people, and checking venues myself. The inspections covered pretty much the entire nightlife corridor, from Street 104 all the way to Street 136, including many of the connector streets and surrounding venues. From what I saw and from the people I spoke with, the focus wasn't on shutting nightlife down. It was about making sure businesses were operating within the law, checking documentation, checking for illegal substances, checking for underage workers, and making sure venues were following the rules. And honestly, if I hadn't known these operations had taken place beforehand, I probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. Street 104 was still active. Street 136 was still active. Street 172 was still active. Riverside was still busy. Bassac Lane was still doing what Bassac Lane does. The rumors spread much faster than the actual impact. In fact, after all the noise settled down, only one bar closed. One. At the same time, new venues opened. Others adapted. Others tightened their procedures. And that's really the biggest change I've noticed. The biggest change isn't that nightlife disappeared. It's that operators became much more careful. For travelers, that's probably not the worst thing in the world. Phnom Penh Nightlife didn't vanish. It adjusted. And Phnom Penh itself changes fast. A venue that's busy today might disappear 6 months from now. A new place can suddenly become the hottest spot in town. That's one of the reasons I keep sharing updates, reviews, openings, closures, and on-the-ground reports inside the VIP Telegram. Because by the time a YouTube video is published, the nightlife map may already look different. But based on what I've seen myself, Phnom Penh Nightlife now looks very different from the dramatic picture many people saw on social media. So what does it actually feel like to walk around Phnom Penh after dark? So after spending years in Cambodia, and plenty of nights walking around Phnom Penh, what's my honest assessment? Honestly, much safer than many people imagine. Sometimes I read comments online and wonder if we're talking about the same city. A lot of opinions seem to come from people who have never actually been here. I've heard, I've read, someone told me. Meanwhile, I'm walking around Riverside, Street 136, Street 172, Bassac Lane, and feeling perfectly comfortable. Now, of course, common sense still applies. No city is completely risk-free, but the risks here are usually not what people imagine. When I'm in Phnom Penh, I'm paying attention to exactly the same things I'd pay attention to in Bangkok, Pattaya, Manila, or Ho Chi Minh City. My surroundings, who I'm talking to, how much I've had to drink. Basic common sense. That's it. Phnom Penh feels less polished than Bangkok, but generally far less chaotic than many people expect. For me personally, it's a city where I feel comfortable walking around after dark. If you've spent time in Phnom Penh, let me know if you agree. So what are the real risks in Phnom Penh? Honestly, probably not the ones you were expecting. After spending years around nightlife scenes across Southeast Asia, I've noticed that most bad stories start in a surprisingly similar way. Too much alcohol, poor decisions, overconfidence, following a stranger you met 10 minutes ago, jumping on a scooter after a long night out, carrying more cash than you need, ignoring obvious red flags because you're on vacation. That's usually how it starts. Not with gangsters, not with criminal networks, not with some dramatic movie scene. And that's why I keep saying the same thing. In most cases, the biggest danger isn't Phnom Penh. It's the traveler. Because the same mistakes that get people into trouble here are the same mistakes that get people into trouble in Bangkok, Pattaya, Manila, Ho Chi Minh City, and pretty much everywhere else. And the reality is, most visitors who use basic common sense have a completely uneventful time in Phnom Penh. The good news? Most of those risks are completely under your control. If a friend was visiting Phnom Penh for the first time tomorrow, I'd probably tell him a few simple things. First, download PassApp. Seriously, it's one of the most useful apps you can have in Cambodia. Think of it as Cambodia's version of Grab. You can book tuk-tuks, see the price before the ride, avoid unnecessary negotiations, and generally make life a lot easier. I still use it all the time. Beyond that, most of it comes down to common sense. Don't carry more cash than you need. Keep your wallet somewhere sensible. Pay attention when using ATMs late at night. And maybe one more thing. Personally, I'd avoid some of those tiny massage shops offering unbelievably cheap prices. Could they be completely fine? Sure. But in my experience, they're usually not worth the hassle. Phnom Penh has plenty of established places, so there's really no reason to roll the dice just to save a few dollars. The same goes for jumping on the back of a random scooter after a long night out, or wandering into isolated streets at 3 in the morning. Could you do it? Sure, but I don't really see the point. And perhaps the most important rule of all, trust your instincts. If something feels off, walk away. There will always be another bar, another restaurant, another tuk-tuk, and another night. Follow those simple rules and you'll probably have the same experience most visitors do. A completely normal night in Phnom Penh. And honestly, that's the reality of this city that rarely makes it into the headlines. So after everything we've talked about, what's the verdict? Phnom Penh isn't the Wild West some people imagine. It's also not Singapore. Most visitors who use common sense will probably have a completely normal trip. Who will enjoy Phnom Penh? People who like cities with character, a more raw and unfiltered nightlife atmosphere, and places that still feel authentic rather than overly polished. Who probably won't? People looking for a perfectly organized, highly polished experience. Videos like this can only cover so much. Things change fast on the ground. That's why I keep sharing updates, venue reviews, closures, openings, and reports from Phnom Penh and other cities inside the VIP Telegram. And now I'm curious. If you've been to Phnom Penh, do you agree with my assessment? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for tagging along with Lazy Nomad. Until our paths cross again in the neon-lit streets of Southeast Asia, keep exploring, but always keep it lazy. Good night, and see you on the next adventure.